Hi everybody, welcome to the webinar. I'm Vita Wright of the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network. Our network works to increase awareness and understanding of science for fire and fuels management. On behalf of our team and partners, welcome to today's webinar, Returning Fire to the Land, Celebrating Traditional Knowledge and Fire with Frank Lake. Research ecologist with the Fuels Program at the Pacific Southwest Research Station. His current research involves wildland fire effects, traditional ecological knowledge, climate change, and ethnoecology with an emphasis on cultural management and fire ecology of forest, shrub, grassland, and riparian environments in the Klamath-Siskiyou bioregion. Welcome, Frank. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. And I understand that we have a good diversity of people calling in, so welcome everybody from our Canadian and First Nations friends and guests, and even some people from Australia and the rest of you from across the United States and different tribal communities and tribes. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. I wanted to thank Megan and Vita for helping me organize this, and then also just real quickly, the co-authors on this paper that we're featuring today and the work of a lot of my other partners that I'll be featuring. So today's presentation for topics and our objectives really here are to look at what are the findings in the discussion and a lot of the things that came out of two main workshops that we had, also from the literature, and then bringing in the findings from across the nation for integrating traditional knowledge into fuels and wildland fire management and research projects. I'll talk briefly about traditional knowledge and the different types of traditional knowledges, particularly this traditional fire knowledge. What were some of the main topics identified in working with tribes and First Nations? And then what are the applications of that knowledge and indigenous knowledge today? And then what I have sprinkled through the presentation are some regional examples that feature some but not all the work being done by tribes, particularly here in the United States, around different fuels reduction, prescribed fire, and managing wildfires, and then also particularly highlighting examples that link that traditional burning in a modern context to achieve different resource objectives. So there has been recognition and a growing interest for the incorporation of traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge or traditional fire knowledge into research and management. And so that's been featured here by the Joint Fire Science, but really we're trying to look at and learn and highlight and really share a broad diversity of work that's happening both regionally, nationally, and internationally. So how does traditional knowledge differ from, say, traditional ecological knowledge? Well, really the two are differentiated, and being that the traditional knowledge is, I guess, is broader or more inclusive of tribal beliefs, philosophies, and practices that integrate both the metaphysical and biophysical ways of knowing on the landscape and across different ecosystems. It is cumulative collective knowledge and that understanding derived from individuals and communities about ecological processes, natural resources, and the socio-cultural adaptive responses to the environment. And you can see some of these definitions by other, like the work of Burkus, and then also this paper by Mason. And in the context for me, just as a tribal descendant in my tribal community here in Northwest California, it's like learning things, as you see here on the right, from my grandfather during subsistence activities, but then also working at tribes. This is Bill Tripp here of the Karuk tribe, and my son Leland. When we connected the prescribed burn, it's our traditional knowledge that comes intergenerationally about the context of our responsibility in fire use. And so for me, it's really being able to pass that on and share that between the relationship of elders to youth. And building upon the work here of Mary Huffman, traditional fire knowledge is really as fire-related knowledge, beliefs, and practices that have been developed and applied on specific landscapes for specific purposes by longtime inhabitants. And her paper and synthesis really looks at 69 distinctive elements of that. And, you know, in the kind of relation to the pictures that we see over here, it really varies by tribe and tribal community or even indigenous community. It might be everything from ceremonial fires or food processing fires to some communities really having a strong presence of an aversion to fire use there, and how we learn that and put that in the context of what our traditional fire knowledge being taught today and some of those challenges around that. There's these factors of fire that are important, and really looking at some of these elements is that it spans a very broad part of the environment, also the social-cultural aspects of how indigenous people live with fire and work with fire in their environment. It could be everything from the geology, topography, and soil, looking at culturally important vegetation or the fuel types, particularly indicators and ways of evaluating the weather and broader effects of climate on those systems, thinking about fire behavior and fire operations, and then really also given a real kind of a local level or particular perspective on what are the beneficial or negative fire effects and how those are evaluated. Also looking at fire governance, and that might be everything from the First Nations or Aboriginal community and tribal communities kind of governmental structure all the way down to governance at the family and traditional roles that individual fire use is taking place, and then an array of other social factors, whether it be local community values versus that of the broader society or the public. And my pictures here just kind of show this in my work with Karuk Indigenous basket weavers, just how that kind of plays itself out and learning that at the local level and putting it in the context of other things happening nationally and internationally. I want to kind of kick this off and just talk a little bit about traditional knowledge and fire philosophies and how that kind of relates to operational projects. So traditional knowledge and fire use by many First Nations and Indigenous people or Aboriginal people is considered a spiritual obligation for resource stewardship practices. There's also this broader understanding for many Indigenous communities that fire is medicine for both people and the land. And I think in particular as we see altered systems and fire regimes, that when you think about prescribed fire, not enough fire, the land and the people can be sick, and if you have too much fire, as far as catastrophic, higher severity, extensive fires go, it might be bad as that might be bad or non-desired as well. And really underlying theme in a lot of my work with tribes and other Indigenous people is that fire is connected to water at all scales, and that water is sacred, and it's one of the highest values to consider. And so for me, again, kind of a social context here is looking about the ceremonial practices and the things that I'm involved with, and then how those relate to our traditional burning today in a modern context to achieve multiple resource objectives. And so that could be the maintenance of traditional knowledge and fire effects, down to looking at the wildland-urban interface and road access around a community, supporting food research, and then also traditional or subsistence gathering opportunities. So there's many documented reasons for why American Indians had fire use or burned. This is just a short list, and I won't be going into all these, but I'll be touching on elements of these throughout examples in the presentation. There was hunting, crop management, pest management, range, particularly for the forage quality of many of the large game that were hunted or used, fireproofing areas, thinking about the wildlife habitat. Clearing areas for travel was an important one, particularly as it took the travel networks from communities to resource areas and clearing that and using fire along those. Clearing riparian areas and along stream sides and wetlands was another important element of fire use. Basketry material and fibers, fuel wood for both heating and cooking, and then many others that were acknowledged within the literature and brought up during the workshops. So when we think about a historical context, I often like to talk about, and many of the other researchers have, think about natural versus cultural fire regimes. And so many tribal fire use objectives connect the knowledge systems, cultural practices, their wellness to the local economy, security, and the quality of life of their livelihoods. And many examples in the literature may talk about natural fire regimes and identify historical tribal burning practices as a component of that, but fewer acknowledge the significance of the actual cultural fire regime or the methods and the extent in which this Aboriginal or Native burning was used as part of the landscape scale influence. Some of this is, at least here in the United States, is kind of at a broad scale depicted as part of the land fire regime condition class. And so really there's changes in climate and fire regimes that affect tribal cultures, but also through tribal war histories and multiple scientific sources, they describe the effects of colonization and fire exclusion on North America and also those tribal cultures. You'll hear me talk about fire-dependent cultures, and that's an important element that links with fire regimes. But there's an array of different reasons, from disease and removal and disruption to both the cultural practices and the land management practices that linked fire and culture together. And there's still some of those issues that are the legacy of colonization today that was important when working with Aboriginal or Indigenous or First Nation or tribal communities to consider that as part of the change in fire regime and change in culture. So what are some of the reasons why researchers and land managers may want to work with tribal governments and communities to document historical landscape changes that resulted from fire suppression or the removal of those Indigenous land use practices and occupancy? And we can think about those, and I just kind of pose that as a kind of an opening question as we go through the rest of this talk. So we need to think about understanding the role fire has in maintaining healthy ecosystems and for tribal communities. And so there's opportunities here for relearning traditional fire knowledge and those cultural burning practices, thinking about the ways that we collectively evaluate the landscape to local level resource fire effects, learning of fire effects from reintroducing fire to culturally valued habitats and the responses of resources, whether it's species or sites in those areas of importance, and thinking about integrating fire-associated resources back into family activities and cultural practices. And, you know, I guess my two examples here are thinking about the work of the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network on restoring tribal or family-based burning, and then thinking about the other efforts here, like the Confederated Tribes of the Salish and Kootenai, and thinking about their stories and bringing fire back on the land project, or fire on the land project they have, and documenting their tribal histories and the importance of today. A way that I have within my research, and also this has been influenced a lot by working with tribes and my colleagues, what are the tribally valued resources and habitats, and putting this kind of within a resource perspective for both resources and habitats, but under a cultural ecosystem services framework. And not to go into this too much, but really for the resources, think about the tangible and intangible elements of the environment, and that really there's a component there that are the landscapes, or these areas that are of significance, sites, but also could be the objects or even a state of mind for the traditional people that are using those places and those habitat and resources. Thinking about natural and cultural resources that are needed to perpetuate those tribal customs, practices, and knowledge systems, and then breaking that down into the particular habitats. What are the characteristics of those, and really what are the resources that support those habitats to support not only single but multiple resources. And if you look at the picture here on the right, for at least here in Northwest California, I'm showing kind of the fire effects here on this Douglas fir, but also how those fire effects affect the mushrooms, or the mycorrhizal relationship that ties to the huckleberries, that ties back to the oaks. And so there's all kinds of foods and materials as far as the resources that are there that make up that as a culturally significant fire affected habitat. So jumping into the workshops now, kind of with that overview, we have the methods, and we're understanding the challenges to the use of traditional knowledge with fire management and research. So there was 2 workshops were convened. The first one was in Polson, Montana, organized with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes Forestry Department, and that was really following upon the recommendations by the Mason et al. Paper, bringing keepers of traditional knowledge together with representatives of management entities, practitioners, and academic and research institutions. And as part of that workshop there with Salish Kootenai, we had field trips and breakout sessions, and as part of that, we focused really on these key topics, which will be kind of an underlying theme of this presentation: cross-jurisdictional management, fuels reduction strategies, wildfire management, and then research. Building upon that first workshop, we convened a second workshop at the Large Wildland Fires Conference in Missoula, Montana in 2014, and really putting this together between the co-leaders, we organized discussion topics and questions around the first workshop themes, and we built that and focused that around communication, understanding, and trust. And we'll get into this a lot more because I think that's at the core, the foundation of the broader level things that got down to some of the specifics, looking at our fuels reduction and prescribed fire, and then wildland fire. And so here's some pictures here of me basically guiding that along, and then also talking about these key elements in this table that we have towards the later part of this presentation. So here's some other findings and discussion. Cross-jurisdictional work and cultural resources came up as pretty strong, important topics. And so for cross-jurisdictional work, it's fuels reduction and wildland fire planning and implementation across multiple land ownerships, and then also doing that in a way that's culturally sensitive, that achieves both cultural and ecological objectives. Cultural resources are legally protected by treaties, laws, executive orders, and other regulations, particularly here in the United States. And resources, they're really culturally important to tribes, including the living resources. And this is one of the things that came up, just besides things like shown here in the pictures as artifacts or a historical cabin, but thinking about the living cultural resources like habitats, plants, animals, and even mushrooms or fungi. And then the workshop participants recommended involving tribes in the development of collaborative management plans, such as participatory geographic information system planning. And then in the United States, we use here the Wildland Fire Decision Support System, for identification of the culturally sensitive values at risk. Some examples of cross-jurisdictional fire management in Western Oregon. I have a little slide here of some of the work that's being done here between the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Nature Conservancy and the Prescribed Fire Council here. They really have their objectives to restore diverse habitats for multiple cultural uses and plant species, reduce invasive species, reduce hazardous fuels, and really to demonstrate to the public that these cooperation across multiple jurisdictions is an important and can be conducted. An example from the Southwest with tribes and partners working to burn together. A variety of tribes here and federal agencies and local fire management departments are working together. And one of their main objectives here is to reduce hazardous fuels for fire suppression and improve the wildlife habitat. So that's another example there in the Southwest US. And then moving from those cross-jurisdictional examples into this decision support system I was talking about, which is how do we think about the protect and the mitigation of impacts of cultural resources and those tribal values. An example here that I often am working with the Forest Service and the local tribes is using tribal representatives or heritage consultants who will assist the resource advisors or the lead resource advisor with identification and locating natural and cultural resources as values at risk, particularly in the long-term planning of where the fire is expected to go under the different burning conditions. Linking those to identifying what objectives and management actions or mitigation measures are part of the incident action plan. And then with that, thinking about your development of your protection and mitigation strategies, planning for both the long and short-term tactical responses to achieve your desired fire effects. And so by working with the tribes and using heritage consultants, really you can look at focusing on point protection or areas that you need to consider for your operational planning and actions, but also managing the wildfire to achieve a variety of resource objectives. Under additional parts for findings and discussion, fuels reduction strategies was an important one that was brought up during the workshops. Although these often focus around the wildland-urban interface or the WUI, many hazardous fuels reduction strategies or projects may also not recognize that fire has a role in promoting broader culturally important plants, habitats, and tribal traditions across the landscape. And that hazardous fuels reduction could be conducted, and those treatments can be conducted in a way that both meet ecological and cultural objectives, and that these strategies can promote cultural resources while also reducing the undesirable impacts of large, intense wildfires. And so in thinking about the panel of examples here, we have a broader landscape of the community, we have some fuels reduction along major roads and edge of community, but particularly, at least in my work with tribes, there's some concern about mastication, using masticators or doing mastication as a fuels reduction strategy, because it often can be indiscriminate on what's taken down as a fuels. And if those fuels are important foods or medicines or a culturally significant shrub or tree, then incorporating that tribal knowledge and values could improve the effectiveness of that fuels treatment because of what's going to be retained. In other cases, you have fuels reduction strategies that might be more on this contractor grid, where you have a non-local contractor who comes in and does things by standard spacing and just sees every tree as kind of a fuel rather than the other cultural ecosystem services that it might provide. So just to think about that when you're doing fuels reduction planning and how you can incorporate tribal knowledge and values into those operations and efforts. In Alaska, and thinking about kind of a regional example, they're having changes in fire regimes up there, and a lot of the hazardous fuels reduction work is around the villages or the wildland-urban interface. We're thinking about community-based natural resource management there. And generally, suppression is kind of more of the desired action to protect subsistence uses, but there's also changes in that culture and community with the difference of cultures across Alaska for their cultural adaptation to changing fire regimes and thinking about the effects of those valued habitats and resources. And so in some cases, you might have strategies that need to look at all that. In thinking about wildland fire management, especially at plant ignitions, prescribed fires are a great opportunity to think about traditional lifeways, increase landscape resilience and heterogeneity. Many tribes identified burning for cultural purposes, but this is often restricted because of land tenure, competing internal and external societal values, and capacity. And so prescribed fires that can be designed to maintain culturally important species, habitats, and places, tribal traditions, and other resource objectives was one of those things that came out during the workshops and in the literature. But also identify obstacles, or identified obstacles of prescribed fire to meet cultural and land management goals. And so some of those were the lack of funding other than just kind of directly fuels management, but also administrative and jurisdictional challenges across landscapes with mixed land management. And so in some cases you might have a working forest or commercial timberlands just opposite of it, or just adjacent to the one jurisdiction, and you have to think about, well, if we want to burn across this landscape, what are some of those competing interests on there? And in my examples here, just to help me frame this, was started off working with the local Fire Safe Council and basket weavers, but now I see more and more, at least here in Northern California, with the Six Rivers National Forest and Crook Tribe, cross-jurisdictional burning to meet different local and tribal objectives. Some examples here in the Northwest is the feature of the Quinault Indian Nation and Nature Conservancy and their partners. Their objectives are to enhance traditional food species, promote basket material, restore wetland and prairie for wildlife and cultural resources, and some of the work that they're doing there. In the Midwest, tribes burning prairie, woodlands, and more, featuring the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Winnebago Agency and the other Sioux tribes of Nebraska. Some of their objectives are restoration and maintenance of healing the forest and rangelands, reduction in hazardous fuels around the wildland urban interface, as well as cultural sites. And then you can basically see here that there's this picture here of the Osage Nation working around some of their ceremonial sites, but also reducing those hazardous fuels with prescribed burning. In the Southeast, there, a different fire regime and climate, having opportunity to burn almost all year long. Applying fire every 3 to 5 years removes invasive plants and disease and allows fires to burn with less intensity. And there's a series of objectives there for them around culturally important plants, for wildlife forage, looking at the quantity and quality and access of important medicine plants for their spiritual practitioners, and removing vegetation that poses risk of tribal infrastructure, homes, and safety. And constructing part of these slides, I want to recognize Robin Royals from BIA Communications and Education Specialist for her sharing her information and the featuring a lot of the work that the Bureau of Indian Affairs does with tribes. Continuing on in the southeastern U.S., integrating fuels management there, thinking about range and wetland habitat improvement. Another strong one there is basketry and wildlife, particularly in riparian systems, and the reduction of hazardous fuels around the wildland interface. And so this is an example of cross-jurisdictional work with the National Park Service, the Muskogee tribe in Florida, and Seminole tribes down there in the southeast United States. In the Great Lakes region, again, tribes there having altered forest and fire regimes, but looking for opportunities with partners. And so the Chippewa and Ojibwe tribes working to prescribe fire councils there, having some of their objectives focused on hazardous fuels reduction, maintaining wildlife habitat, particularly moose browse, site prep, and thinking about restoration of both plants and wildlife species, controlling insects and diseases. Here, another emphasis on traditional foods linked to cultural burning and fire regimes, and then also broader goals and objectives linking to cultural landscape scenic values. So kind of moving on from those little regional examples here, we would think about wildfire management and as an unplanned ignition, and identified key topics for that were really fires managed to meet objectives on tribal lands or across jurisdictions, communication, planning, education, and then funding to support wildland fire management. And some of those overarching themes for that were, again, lack of communication or miscommunication between managers and local communities, between agencies and tribes. And I think one part here is to try to get out of a little bit when we're talking to tribal communities or our tribal partners, as well as the other community members, is looking at the kind of the jargon we use in both fire science and fire management, and kind of using our more plain and clear and more personable forms of communication, and how that facilitates trust and being able to understand each other. And part of that was to develop strategies and approaches that improve communication between the incident managers, or particularly incident management teams, the agency decision makers, and tribes. There's also the identification of efforts are needed to improve or mitigate adverse impacts to cultural resources, such as sacred sites or other highly significant cultural use areas where fire suppression tactics may have undesirable impacts. And a part of that, and my work as a resource advisor here in Northern California, is a lot of times tribes will say, this allow wildfire to burn through these areas, or assigning local tribal staff, such as heritage consultants, to work on point protection or mitigation as part of those treatments, and that should be considered. An example here from the interior Pacific Northwest and Columbia Basin, where there's kind of an alignment of both timber resources with cultural resources, featuring some of the tribes there. They face increasingly larger wildfires and threats to their communities, particularly their forest rangelands and different resources across the landscape. And so these tribes collectively have looked at the effects of suppression on fires that threaten life and property in those resources, managing wildfire to reduce the impacts or enhance fire-dependent resources. That also includes timber and cultural resources together, and thinking about how fire is burning through those jurisdictions, range management or rangeland management for grazing and non-forest resources, and in a particular one there, as in many First Nations or other tribal communities, the protection of water resources and fisheries. In the Rocky Mountain region, often they're looking at managing wildfire, is it suppression or fire use, and the opportunities that you have depending on long duration wildfires. And this example here with the Salish Kootenai tribes on the Flat Indian Reservation is looking at integrating also multiple seasons of prescribed fire and managing wildfire, and having those objectives to, again, focus around the wildland urban interface, around communities, protect and enhance both commercial forest products, and to improve wildlife habitat while not impacting those cultural resources, and then also maintaining vegetation diversity, particularly to those tribal important foods and medicines. Another example here, our case study area is looking at the Rocky Mountain region in the United States. For the Southern Ute, prescribed burning objectives for them were cultural and traditional values, providing employment and training opportunities. If I don't mention this, I think it's an important element is a lot of tribes are wanting to have workforce training and recruit and retain as part of their workforce their tribal members and community members. Another element of that was looking at fiscal accountability and responsibility for the management of wildfires and the cost that goes into that, but linking that also to forest restoration for timber and for wildlife habitat. And then some of the other tribes there featured in that area for their objectives, like with the Crow, firefighter and public safety, again focusing on reducing fuels around the wildland interface, thinking about control of shrub growth and forage, range improvement, again another thing on noxious weeds and thinking about the reduction in those, and then trying to manage wildfire for resource objectives. And then the last one, certain reservations or certain jurisdictions, based on their capacity and the resources they have to manage fire, is in some cases aggressively suppress fire and control that as far as unplanned ignitions on reservations, and then manage wildfire for those resource objectives where and when possible. In the Southwest, working to burn for many resources and for culture there, featuring this work here, the San Carlos Apache and their cooperators identified some of their objectives and values as restoring and maintaining resilient landscapes, increased community and firefighter safety, enhanced fire management opportunities, particularly looking at the sequence of recent fires and burning into that former fire footprint and using their landscape fuels treatments to link into that as well, and having a greater potential to reduce suppression costs and minimizing fire size, and also generally minimizing the negative effects of fire on those valued resources. Touch here a little bit about the research, and so out of the findings and discussion part, we talked about the management, but also research is an important element, especially when we look at traditional knowledge, or TK, or Western knowledge, as far as the Western knowledge system in that. Some of the issues around sharing traditional knowledge and Western knowledge, communication challenges between researchers and the tribes, including the sharing of traditional knowledge from tribal elders and with managers and researchers, how comfortable they feel about that and having that good rapport and working relationship. There's a need for having best practices for investigating and sharing traditional knowledge are needed. Many tribes have cultural committees or resource advisory boards that have research protocols, and so being aware of that. And then this last one is that not so much on the researchers as a negative point, but just that research inquisitiveness can harm relationships if researchers inadvertently offend tribal members with their questions and assumptions. And so sometimes there's kind of a cultural training that needs to get there when you're working with any indigenous, First Nations, or Aboriginal community, is to be like, what are some of the protocols and the processes? And that could be in elder dynamics, gender dynamics. But in a side example there, I've actually had researchers say, after tribal elders have shared their perspective on spiritual beliefs or something that was important to them, and have the researchers say, and you really believe that? And those kinds of things, that can deteriorate a working relationship right off the bat. So I just encourage researchers to be open and try to approach a respectful working relationship the best way they can. And so, defining that is important in research. The other element here is thinking about tribal questions are discussed that are relevant while also respectful and sensitive that traditional knowledge in tribal cultures. And researchers are aware of tribal intellectual property rights, data sharing, and ownership agreements for the use of traditional knowledge. And there's more and more, I guess, of a interest in tribes developing this, so they actually know at the end of the project, who has the rights for everything from the images of the photos down to the data, and having that all worked out. And the framework will talk about that a little bit later. Some findings and discussions. Trust and understanding also leads to effective management research. Relationships built on common understanding and trust among those partners involved. Managers of research need to be able to understand both broad versus specific tribal fire-related issues and values, and then also thinking about the prescriptions and treatments that reflect both local and general public values for projects and for those programs. And research partnerships that incorporate tribal knowledge and values can really help support and foster the development of the best available science to guide management and for the formation of meaningful policy that serves not only the tribal community, but the public. Some of the implications or recommendations that came out of the workshops and the literature review and were brought up by the workshop participants kind of led me to wanting to work with my co-authors on developing this framework. And I'm going to get into this now for a few slides, but really to provide the framework for improving fire management and research based on traditional and Western knowledge systems, including these 10 key elements, which I'll go into further. And then really the objective of this framework, we're hoping, was to strengthen communication for developing trust and those partnerships among managers, scientists, and for tribal members. So the first two elements here, and they're kind of structured this way, is the first one being element one is sources of traditional knowledge, and not going to go all into these, but just kind of as a point of reference, so you to go back and if you want to look at the paper or the webinar later, is framed under basically a column of management and a column of research that pertains to each of the elements on the left. So for sources of traditional knowledge, and the management might be for publications and presentations. For research is conducting our literature review. On the tribal outreach element, request a tribal government, cultural committee, or members for the incorporation of tribal knowledge, contact those tribes, do the outreach, learn of what their short and long-term project objectives are. On the research side, contact tribes and tribal organizations, particularly for what are their researchable questions and interest, and what is the science support needs they have. Often researchers come into a tribal or indigenous community, say, this is what I want to research, but I think it's important that researchers be open-minded broadly for their research topic of interest around fuels and fire management or use of indigenous knowledge, but go to those tribal communities or First Nations or Aboriginal communities and say, what are your researchable questions and what are your science support needs, and come in there more as a support service rather than more extractive initial contact. Under these other parts, for the third and fourth element, the third one would be tribal consultation. At least here in the United States, there's this mandates for government to government for federal agencies with federally recognized tribes. And so consult with those tribes, whether it be under the management of both a project that might have the National Environmental Policy Act requirements or an emergency consultation as far as wildfire. On the research side, request input from tribal councils, departments, and committees to develop your preliminary research questions and methods and how you're going to go about for that science support and research needs and building that. And then that goes on to building trust, which was tribal identification, transfer, and authorization of traditional knowledge use. On the management side, thinking about these management agreements, identify tribal representatives and those heritage advisors to support that. And then on the research side, thinking about the institutional review board or other federal agency or state agency requirements, and then tribal approval process that goes along with that. Element 5, learning, active learning for traditional knowledge and Western knowledge. Think about cross-cultural appreciation for use of knowledge, both in management actions and research methods. On the management one here, workforce education is really important to think about the effects on heritage and cultural resources, and that this traditional knowledge can inform your environmental analysis or the wildland fire decision support system planning during wildfires. On the research side, really thinking about researcher and student education on traditional knowledge, fire use, and fire effects through their academic courses. This is tribes having good academic relationships with professors and teaching that in the curriculum is important. Also hosting workshops such as the ones we did, and fostering field trips and that on learning on the ground. And an important one for me is having a tribal resource mentor who really kind of took me under her wing and showed me a lot of what I needed to as a researcher in my tribal community. Tribal oversight, this sixth element is an important one. And thinking about coordination and communication with tribes on the planning, implementation of projects. On the management side, having tribes review those proposed management treatments and those incident objectives and identifying the missing values or issues. And then on the research side, tribes basically approving that research method, thinking about the metrics that you're going to use, the analysis that is planned, and identifying specific values or addressing issues of concern early on in that project. Another part of these elements was active listening and sharing. You know, a lot of, I see increasing awareness of working with tribal partners, particularly government to government. So having tribal participation or community members on maybe even interdisciplinary teams, or working as a tribal liaison and working with those incident command teams. On the research side, there's a lot of emphasis from tribes that I have worked with on including tribal members and youth as research assistants, helping collect data with tribal members, and then if you need to, conduct interviews or other things that are needed to help shape and develop that research further. And on this other eighth element, applying these knowledge together, really tribal participation in those stewardship or research activities, going to helping understand what's going to go on with the treatment, the fire operations and mitigation on the management side, and then really here on the research side, thinking about how traditional knowledge collaboratively guides the experimental methods, your study site selection, the types of treatments, what are your indicators or how you're going to evaluate a changing condition or the effects of a treatment for your research, and then what are the variables of research interest, that how those are developed. It's not what the scientist wants, but what also those are important to the tribe or tribal community. And then this last part on the element 9, tribal review is important, particularly on the management, to look at project implementation or the fire management, maybe modify or have efforts to support adaptive management to improve the treatment effectiveness. On the research side, the one thing that I would say here is important is that as a researcher, when we finally conducted the research and we have the analysis done, we've developed our results and our findings, is before that goes out to a journal for peer review, is having a chance for the cultural committee or the resource advisory board of the tribe or your tribal partner review that. And for me as a research scientist at PSW, when it goes to my technical and policy review before I submit it to the journal, that's when I often give the tribe a chance to look at that one more time before it's sent to the journal. And then the last part on reporting, I think we really need to share and celebrate our accomplishments and what we learned from that cooperative working arrangement. And that, and in part, can be, you know, on the management side, how were things there as far as the post-fire after-action review? What were some of our lessons learned? And then again, on the research side, really helping create together as a partnership the best available science that's presented in our publications and our presentations, the co-authorship and the acknowledgement of that traditional knowledge and that investment from that tribal community into that work. And thinking about implications, recommendations as how traditional knowledge informs effective fire management, switching from the table there a little bit. It can inform managers, researchers, and the public about how wildland fire affects the tangible and intangible values associated with natural and cultural resources. I've already talked about that a bit. Both knowledges can enhance understanding of fire effects and associated cultural practices for fire-influenced landscapes, for different ecosystems, habitats, and a range of fungi, plant, and animal species. And I think really here on this one is that if you're working with one tribe or an indigenous community in one area or region, it may be similar, but also could be very different when you go to a different region or work with a different tribe or a different indigenous community. And so just thinking that what you learn from one place may be transferable, but also may have certain limitations as you go to another indigenous community or region. The way that I've helped kind of frame this as a researcher, actually working with Kevin Ryan and through this idea of the thorough fire effects, but you have direct and then you have your indirect impacts to the fire environment and your first order fire effects, but then this idea here that there's those impacts. And so you might have living cultural resource in this example here in the photo of a conifer or sugar pine tree here that was identified as a hazard tree on the line, but the tribal people say in the area that, hey, there's a special ridge system there, and you might find cultural features like this artifact of a river rock near there. And so when we think about fire impacts, this is not the suppression activities or the fire effects, but it's all of that in its totality that has both those indirect and direct. And so how we think about that, both as a tangible and intangible effect on that particular system in place. Moving forward here, again, a lot of it was, again, consultation, coordination, and communication promotes good, strong, effective collaboration. And so building relationships and trust require fire management challenges across jurisdictional boundaries. So thinking about cross jurisdictions, particularly within ancestral or Aboriginal territory of your First Nations or tribal or Aboriginal group, consultation policies and directives for, at least here in the United States, for American Indian tribes, support coordination and communication to help build that trust, gain respect, and foster that collaboration, plus also the willingness of what you can both bring to that. Initiating communication across cultural and jurisdictional boundaries improves the formation and use of traditional knowledge and Western knowledge for effective fire management and research, and then really making sure that your collaboration or your collaborative goals are clear, and that member roles and responsibilities and how they contribute to that, and what's the decision-making authority. And so that was another part there is, do we all understand what we're bringing to that and what we're going to do together? And then ultimately, at least here in the United States, when there's many different collaboratives, is it the agency that's going to be the final decision-making authority, like the line officer, or is it a co-management project in which there's an equal authority power there about the actions and the implications of that work made between, say, the lead agency and the tribe? So just to think about the different structure and how that across jurisdictions is going to play out. Some of our key findings, kind of wrapping things up here a little bit more on our conclusions. Some of the key findings that emerged during the workshops that were reiterated in the literature and were brought out by session participants is communication is critical to effective communication across tribal and non-tribal management research entities. Communication about traditional knowledge should be done in a culturally sensitive and respectful way that honors those traditions, cultures, and the sensitivities of types of knowledge that are shared. I'm often told within my tribal community that traditional knowledge is a responsibility, and even though I may gain that knowledge as a researcher, I still have a responsibility in how I conduct myself for the sharing of that knowledge or the promotion of the cultural management systems that perpetuate that knowledge. And so just as researchers, like example here in my projects, getting scientists out on the ground with the managers and with the tribal leaders and the practitioners is important there, and thinking about that as being one of the best ways of communication, and also thinking about what we need to disclose or not for what we learn out in the field. And part of that is also that trust and that sensitivity around the topics or places that you visit as prospective research and management sites. In addition to identifying culturally sensitive resources and values, traditional knowledge can inform and guide fields and fire management to perpetuate those living and non-living resources that are culturally important. Collaboration will be most effective if time is spent to build those relationships, gain trust and share knowledge, and recognize the different perspectives on the outcomes and implications of fire and resource management. And I'm thankful to some of my tribal partners at the Karuk and Yurok tribe who are often, just because you've learned this in a cultural setting, Frank, doesn't mean that you necessarily have the right to share all that, but also helping me understand, what are the implications of if I publish this or share this as a way of a learning tool, what's the sensitivity or the vulnerability that might reflect on the tribes or the people I'm working with. So I keep that in the back of my mind and share that with you. Some of the other findings there were to gain support for using fire as a tool for multiple objectives and for community awareness. The perspective are just the societal understanding of fire, and then what are the traditional ecological roles of fire, both including the culturally important ecosystem services. And again, I bring that back around because often we think about ecosystem services, but as Bill Tripp, a colleague of mine at Crew Tribe, says, it's human services to the ecosystem, and that traditional stewardship responsibility that's important to keep in mind for our resource objective and fire management today. And there's really a need to identify and to highlight examples of successful cross-jurisdiction collaboration for research and management being conducted with tribes. And for me, at least my work, both as a practitioner and as a researcher, is with the Nature Conservancy's TREX, Training Exchange, and Indigenous Peoples Burning Network, as making a real difference here in my community on the ground with my work and the others that I'm working with. So just some kind of, we've gone through the specifics of some of the workshop findings. I wanted to, in the last few slides here, on some kind of broader context that's at least applicable here in the United States, but also think about if you're in Canada or Australia or your other country, how that might also work for you. But thinking about landscape restoration strategies that focus on this heterogeneity or diversity and the resilience considerations, particularly resilience of socio-cultural systems, thinking about climate change vulnerability assessments and adaptation planning efforts, identifying those both climate and non-climate threats and stressors, particularly those associated with fire, thinking about planning considerations for those cultural ecosystem services within that climate approach. Within the United States, we have the National Cohesive Strategy for Wildland Fire Management implementation. It has 3 components: resilient landscapes, fire adapted communities. A part of that is this not only being a fire adapted community, but what about your indigenous First Nations or Aboriginal people that are fire dependent cultures, and thinking about how we support that. Thinking about safe and effective wildfire management response as part of that 3rd component. And then lastly, for me, I think really linking these together to tribal and rural community values is the alignment of multiple resource objectives with community values for the reintroduction of fire or for managing wildfire to achieve those resource benefits. And the part here is really that thinking about traditional knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge as far as restoration of forests, fire regimes, and cultural practices. I think in many areas that can be a form of climate adaptation. And so let's think about our objectives to restore cultural fire regimes that will promote the structure, composition, ecological and culturally valued functions of forest, shrub, and grasslands or other habitats, teaching it traditional knowledge and fire ecology to both the tribal youth and adults. And so we have collective learning together, thinking about initial field reduction and prescribed fire treatments that are located near our communities that focus around the wildland interface, also those critical road or trail systems, and then those ridges are the strategic features around our communities. So we can start thinking about managing fire both near and across other broader aspects of the landscape. So having those treatments that promote socio-ecological resilience of fire-adapted habitats while supporting those fire-dependent cultures. And then really, again, my theme there is, reinstating traditional burning in a modern context to achieve multiple resource objectives. And again, I feature some of the opportunities here that are played out and being shown across the nation here and other places with the Nature Conservancy's treks, the work of the fire safe councils, our prescribed fire councils, and working in tribal and tribal communities, and other things like here, the Bureau of Indian Affairs Reserve Treaty Lands Program that might be looking at opportunities across jurisdictions within a tribe's ancestral territory. And the last little part here is just, as any government or institution, there's these existing policies and authorities. I've mentioned the cohesive strategy. They have a workshop coming up in Reno, Nevada, and end of March. And I'm helping to propose a session there on incorporating tribal knowledge. And so if there's any tribes that are interested and are working as the National Cohesive Strategy as part of their wildland fire management, I'd like to solicit your participation in that. There's also things like the Cooperative Wildland Fire Master Management and Stafford Act Response Agreement for involving tribes and cost-sharing benefits during large wildfire incidents. There's other things like the National Historic Preservation Act, Archaeological Resource Protection Act, and then there's other authorities that pertain to certain jurisdictions that you should be aware of. And there's others that are probably nationally or locally applicable, but at least here in the United States, there's this one right now currently, HR 2936 under the Resilient Federal Forest Act of 2017 that has this authority here, just to point this out, that a geographic area that presents a feature or involves circumstances principally relevant to that American Indian tribes, such as the federal forest land ceded to the United States by treaty, federal land within the boundaries of a current or former reservation or forest and adjacent land to be treated as tribal homelands. And so there might be some opportunity there, and just looking at the more emergent policy that could affect working with traditional knowledge across multiple jurisdictions. And with that, I just want to, again, thank all the different tribal managers and resource specialists who share their knowledge and who I work with, Joint Fire Science Program, our partners at Rocky Mountain Research Station and the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network, and my own PSW Fire and Fields Program. And then my work is done closely a lot with the Nature Conservancy's Indigenous Peoples Burning Network. And lastly, my co-authors who featured this work here in this webinar, but really I couldn't have done it with them. And this last bit over here, I have suggested resources for additional information here that you probably can't see, but as you download the webinar, you can learn those and have those available in the future. So thank you.
Thanks, Frank. That was a great summary. I'm sure we could spend a lot of time on quite a few of the topics that you raised, so thank you for summarizing those. It appears that Megan, are you, there's a question, but I can't see it. Megan,
I'm going to change the presenter to Megan. Is that who I should change it to now? Is Megan, so we can do the question and answer?
Sure.
Okay,
Sure.
so I'm passing it to you. And there we'll go to our question and answer session now.
And while that's happening, I'd like to reiterate on behalf of the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network our appreciation of the Confederated Salish Kootenai Tribes, Salish Kootenai College, and University of Idaho for helping organize that 2014 workshop, and thanks to Frank for help with both of those workshops. So Megan, if you see a question, can you share that with Frank, please?
Sure, it looks like it's just an FYI that the Florida tribe is the Miccosukee.
Okay.
That's the only question we have right now. Someone's hand was raised earlier, and if you have a question and your hand was raised, if you still have a question, you could raise it again and I can unmute you to ask it, or if you want to type in the question quickly, we can do that as well. Oh, it looks like some more questions are coming in.
And I might apologize right now if I said tribal names or if I got something wrong. It's really, there was so much content to try to think about sharing, so if I said something wrong, my apologies. I just wanted to make sure that I was trying to represent, and if I misrepresented, I apologize.
Okay, Frank, here's another question. Were smoke impacts of concern or also part of the study or studies?
Smoke was identified, so yes it was, but it was one that we didn't really get down into a whole bunch, other than that I know that it was during some of the air quality and emission standards that we have these long duration wildfires, that smoke is an impact to both tribal and the public and other communities. But if anything that I saw, and this was kind of something from more of the air quality manager's perspective, was that they never really highlighted the beneficial role that wildfire smoke has. And so often tribes acknowledge, and at least my work here in Northwest California with the Karuk and the Yurok and other tribes, is that in burning certain forest types, that you also see smoke as a fumigant that will really kind of clear out non-desired pests and other insects in the canopy of the trees. And so there's kind of this beneficial effect of smoke. Also, I have research going on with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the tribes, and another associate looking at the beneficial effects of smoke on cooling river temperatures that benefit fish. And so I guess the one thing there is, yeah, smoke was, but didn't really have time to get into that. Mostly a lot of the prior literature and research is focused on the negative impacts. I think on looking at the traditional knowledge and the beneficial role that smoke has at different scales is an emergent place of the research that could be investigated further in other tribal communities.
Great, thanks, Frank. Next question is, how do we accommodate the needs for keeping confidential information about traditional knowledge and cultural resources?
That's where I'd say having a good working relationship with your tribal partners and thinking about what they feel comfortable that should be shared or disclosed or not, particularly as I do a oral presentation, but even in the publications and public presentations. So there's that, and then having a check-in. So like when I initiate a research project, it'll go through tribal council or cultural committee review or this advisory board. And then again, before you go to share those findings or even your preliminary results, is going back and working with them and saying, what do you feel comfortable with? How much should be disclosed or shared here? Another element of that is I often do a lot of ethnographic or historical research that were work done by early anthropologists on tribal communities. And just because it was written down and it's part of those footnotes on that microfiche at the university archives doesn't mean that that same thing, even though it's deep and buried but it's publicly available, should be reiterated or shared again. And so I've had sometimes a caution shared with me saying, no, just because you found out in the field notes of this anthropologist about our spiritual beliefs or about a particular area of cultural significance doesn't mean that you should share that publicly. And so just some ideas around that, about checking in and figuring out what you should share or shouldn't share, and to what degree.
Great. One more question. So far, building trust with tribal communities is essential. How do you recommend beginning those communications? At the tribal council level or something else?
I found in my work that working with a tribal practitioner or elder, and that's often a leader in their community, who then also wears the other hat or has another role that's often on the cultural advisory committee or on tribal council. And so find that strong tribal leader, practitioner, elder person who you can develop that friendship with, develop that trust, get that working project forward, and then have them be the one that also carries your research interest forward or your management for projects forward. And so that's worked for me, and I recommend that. Also, I think there's a lot of tribal communities have like organizations, like it could be the Intertribal Timber Council, or it could be the California Indian Basket Weavers Association. There's other associations out there that are tribal organizations that have interest in fire and forest management, and working with them to kind of help promote your work and your interests is another way to go about that, perhaps.
Great. And we have another one. How could this information or experience be integrated into the planning of future protected areas, nationally and even internationally?
I think that's an important one, particularly where there's generally the protected areas have a high conservation value, have a higher level of biological integrity, and are probably highly significant to most of the indigenous or Aboriginal or First Nations people that are there. When thinking about that, is what are the long-term planning goals for that jurisdiction? And if fire is a main ecological process there, how much of that fire essentially was a cultural fire regime, and what are the ways that you could work with those tribal or indigenous communities to perpetuate and reinstate that traditional or cultural burning as part of those larger conservation approaches. I think also too is that in my work, a lot of those areas that are highly biodiverse are also culturally significant or have a lot of sacred area attribution to them. And so thinking about what you do in an area for your, say, your corridors and your planning, what are the other management or not that's going to be allowed as part of that protected area. I think at least in Australia and other places, they have examples of protected areas that involve indigenous communities as rangers or as local stewards. That's a good approach. And also I think about ways that if you have, say, whether it's a federal or crown or whatever it might be for the jurisdiction at that kind of higher level, is there opportunities for local tribal or indigenous involvement on the committees or decision-making authority that happens for that protected lands. And so just because it's protected, that doesn't necessarily exclude indigenous participation and involvement in life ways on that protected area. If you have bigger conservation goals, how can you still achieve that with involving and not excluding that indigenous community, but working together to perpetuate those broader conservation tenets and practices and the integrity of that place?
Great, thanks, Frank. And we have one more question from Mary Huffman to wrap up the question period. It seems that in Australia, Indigenous peoples and others work to sustain living culture. In the US, we talk more about artifacts. How can we open minds in the US to keeping living culture thriving?
Thank you, Mary, for that. It's important, and that's the part where I think the findings of these workshops and from our tribal partners, where that cultural resources also are living components of the landscape. And it's just, you know, I often use the example that if you're just going from the policy or the laws, the acts like the Ecological Resource Protection Act, and you're going to protect the stone tool, that's the process, that's the indicator of the processing features, food features in that site, then you're protecting the rock, but you're letting the habitat that produced that food that the artifact was a part of basically degrade. And so we need to move away from that. And I think as more tribes and indigenous communities voice the living cultural resource aspect of their work, then that's going to affect the policy development, and that's going to affect the ways that these things, such as the National Historic Preservation Act for traditional cultural properties in the United States, is understood. that you're just not protecting the relic, but you're actually protecting the continuance of that cultural practice and knowledge system today and into the future on that piece of landscape. And to the degree in which tribes and First Nations or other Aboriginal groups want to share the living cultural aspects of the landscape, then that will strengthen that approach. Any other questions or thoughts?
There are some more questions, but given the time, I think we better wrap up. Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Megan. Before ending, I'd like to share information about 2 upcoming webinars that are being hosted by the Joint Fire Science Program Fire Science Exchanges. One is on December 6th, Using Narrative Stories to Understand Traditional Ecological Knowledge in the Great Basin. And one is on December 19th, a climate change assessment of vegetation, fire, and ecosystem services for tribal lands in the Pacific Northwest. You can find information on both of those at nrfirescience.org under upcoming events and webinars. Again, the recording to this webinar will be at nrfirescience.org under past events and webinars. And as you close the webinar, a brief survey will pop up. If you can take a minute to complete that, we would really appreciate your feedback. If you have more questions regarding this webinar or requests for future webinars, please email or call Megan, who's listed at the bottom of this slide. Thank you all for your participation today, and thanks, Frank, for a great presentation. This concludes our webinar.
I appreciate your time.